We had a little change in the schedule. We're going to have Dr. Martinez talk first because he has a hard stop. And then we're going to have His Eminence Cardinal Tomasi come up for a conversation. So, right. Okay, we're ready. So our lunch speaker today is Daniel Martinez. He's a distinguished scholar and associate professor of sociology and co-director of the Binational Migration Institute at the University of Arizona. Dr. Martinez is the co-editor of and contributor to a recently released special edition of the Journal of Migration and Human Security, Don Curran being the other co-editor, focusing on the untold story, the often untold story of migrant deaths at the U.S.-Mexico border and beyond. An important finding from Dr. Martinez is the effect of restrictive asylum policies on the number of migrant deaths, which is, in part, is what he's going to talk about today. So welcome, Dr. Martinez from Arizona. Appreciate your time, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation. My sincere apologies that I cannot be with you all in person. But before I get started, can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, just want to make sure. Sometimes I have some issues with this external mic. My apologies, I'm not able to be with you all in person. I had a conference this past weekend in San Francisco. Just got back yesterday, and then I teach tomorrow, so my apologies, I can't be with you today. So my name is Dan Martinez. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sociology. I'm also one of the co-directors of the Binational Migration Institute here at the University of Arizona. And what I'd like to talk to you all about today is the special issue of the Journal of Migration and Human Security that we recently co-edited with several folks. But before we do that, I'd like to just give you a quick overview of what we do at the Binational Migration Institute. I'll highlight then a couple of articles from the special issue, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about where you can find us, the Binational Migration Institute online, and then be happy to open it up for questions. So the Binational Migration Institute was actually established at the University of Arizona about 20 years ago in 2004. And I came into this, into the Binational Migration Institute as a graduate student myself back in the day. The Binational Migration Institute really came out of the community's calls for doing research that's relevant to the immigrant community here in Southern Arizona. So our founding director, Raquel Rubio Goldsmith, and the other co-director, Ana O'Leary Ochoa, we're both faculty members here at the University of Arizona, but also very active in the community and various NGOs as well as immigrant rights groups here in Southern Arizona. So really, Binational Migration Institute came out of this need to engage in grounded research in the community identified by community members themselves. And so that's something that we've been doing for quite some time. So you can see our overall mission here is really to foster binational collaboration between institutions here in the United States and abroad, particularly Mexico, and really with a focus on better understanding how immigration policies and border enforcement have affected our communities here in Southern Arizona within this 100-mile border zone from the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, the Binational Migration Institute has focused on, for instance, the relationship between border enforcement and immigration, border enforcement and policing, border enforcement and health. But one of our core projects that we've contributed to, or one of the core areas that we've really contributed to over the past 20 years, has been the relationship between border enforcement and border crosser deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly here in Southern Arizona. And so the Binational Migration Institute actually published a seminal report back in 2006, drawing on data from the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. It's a medical examiner here in the county in which University of Arizona is located. Again, just 60 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. And they essentially, the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner, I'll be drawing on a little bit of their data throughout today's talk, but they, in my opinion, they really represent the gold standard, or they have set the standard when it comes to investigating migrant deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border. Truly, they've set the standard. There's really no other medical legal authority along the border that has done what they've done and the commitment that they've shown to this issue over the last 20 years. But back in 2005, we started working closely with them to try to get a better sense of the relationship between increased border enforcement or militarization in southern Arizona and migrant fatalities. And so that partnership led to this seminal report that we published in 2006, where we showed that segmented border militarization along the border, for instance, in places like El Paso, Juarez, San Diego, Tijuana, Nogales effectively funneled undocumented migrants into southern Arizona, remote areas of southern Arizona, thereby leading to an increase in deaths. And that was kind of the report that kicked off Binational Migration Institute's work on migrant fatalities. So since then, we've published several reports, as well as an edited volume, dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles. And last year, we actually held a in-person mini conference on border crosser deaths, which really gave rise to the special issue that I'm going to talk about today. So this special issue just was released earlier this semester, back in September. It features 11 articles on undocumented border crosser deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border, including perspectives from practitioners as well as academics, members of NGOs. So again, we have the perspectives of folks who are working on this issue: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. So again, it features 11 distinct articles, as well as a intro piece that Don and I put together, really kind of highlighting some of the main themes and contributions of the work. So again, just a special thanks to Don Kerwin, as well as my other co-editor, Courtney Siegert from Texas State University. So to kind of give you a sense of what we did in this special issue, first I want to mention that this special issue is a collaborative effort by what we call the working group, or it's the working group for accounting migrant fatalities along the U.S.-Mexico border. This working group is a group we've been meeting for roughly 3 years, over the past 3 years. And it's a group of, again, practitioners, researchers, academics, members of NGOs from across the U.S.-Mexico border. There's roughly I think there's about 25 of us that are involved in this working group. And the reason this working group came together is because, unfortunately, there really isn't any centralized, standardized effort to try to enumerate and track migrant fatalities on the along the U.S.-Mexico border. Well, you might say, well, what about Border Patrol? Border Patrol release their migrant death estimates every year. They've been doing so since fiscal year 1998. And in fact, what you see here on the screen, these are no migrant deaths collected by Border Patrol from, I believe, it would have been October of 97 all the way up through 2017. So it's missing, data from the last 7 years. But one thing I'll mention is that we have found in our work, as well as not only Binational Migration Institute's work, but several other scholars, including folks who contributed to the special issue, including an article by my colleague Stephanie Loiter from UT Austin Strauss Center, where we actually demonstrate empirically that Border Patrol typically undercounts undocumented border crosser deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border. We have data illustrating that they undercount deaths in California, here in southern Arizona, in New Mexico, as well as parts of Texas, right? So I invite you to take a look at Stephanie's article. There she spent some time talking about the factors that are associated with Border Patrol's undercount. I won't get to that right now, but what I will mention is, okay, so why does this matter? Why does it matter that Border Patrol systematically undercounts these deaths? Again, we don't have a centralized independent system to try to track and enumerate deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border. So typically when academics, journalists, researchers, even policymakers want to get a sense of the extent of migrant fatalities along the U.S.-Mexico border, what do they turn to? They turn to Border Patrol estimates, right? And because these Border Patrol estimates are from Customs and Border Protection, part of DHS, they're oftentimes seen as official migrant death estimates and are given a sense of legitimacy when compared to other sources, right? But again, as we've demonstrated, Border Patrol systematically undercounts border crosser deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border. And that is another issue. For us, it's an issue because if we're trying to address migrant deaths, if we're trying to identify policies that can help reduce migrant death and suffering along the border, the first step is to have a good understanding of the extent of those deaths in real time as possible. So not only does Border Patrol tend to undercount migrant fatalities, but we also know that there's an extreme lag in terms of actually publicly releasing these data. For instance, if you're to go to Border Patrol's website or CBP's website, you can only get migrant death estimates up through fiscal year 2022. And as you all know, we are now in fiscal year 2025, if I'm not mistaken, right? So we have not yet seen data for 2024, for 2023, let alone 2024. So having these data in real time is really important for trying to craft interventions to try to reduce migrant deaths and suffering, right? So part of the whole reason that we came together last year in Southern Arizona was to essentially try to work towards a standardization process. And so again, this special issue really is a joint effort between what we call the working group, the Center for Migration Studies of New York, as well as the Binational Migration Institute. Now, you might want to ask, you might be wondering, well, why don't we have a centralized standardized system to try to enumerate deaths along the border? Well, a lot of this has to do with differences in the way that migrant deaths are investigated, right? There's quite a bit of variation across the border when it comes to practices and procedures and whether or not, the types of medical legal authorities that investigate these deaths. So for instance, here in Southern Arizona, we're very fortunate to have a county level medical examiner system, right? Here in Southern Arizona, if there is an unattended non-natural death, it doesn't matter if the person is a foreign national or a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. If there's an unattended non-natural death, it warrants a medical investigation. It warrants an autopsy, right? So anytime there is, let's say, for instance, somebody comes across remains while hiking or while hunting in Southern Arizona, they contact local law enforcement. Local law enforcement responds to the scene, and then they contact the medical examiner's office here in Pima County to take custody of the remains and then start the investigation process, right? They work to try to identify the individual, and then once they identify them, they work with local consulates as well as NGOs to try to reunite those remains with the families, the individual's loved ones, right? Okay, so that's what we have here in Southern Arizona. We have a medical examiner system. For instance, and in California, they kind of use a patchwork. In California, San Diego County uses a medical examiner system, but then Imperial County uses a coroner system that's tied to the sheriff's department, right? And so they don't necessarily have the same standards when it comes to, or the same capabilities or resources. New Mexico, very similar to Arizona, has a medical office of medical investigator, but it's at the state level, and it's located in Albuquerque, which is 7-hour drive from the border. And then we have Texas. Texas is not to be cliche, it's kind of the Wild West when it comes to this stuff because they use a patchwork. They have the overwhelming majority rely on justices of the peace, which essentially they're just signing off on death certificates. They're not doing investigations. They're not taking DNA samples. They're not working to definitively establish a cause of death through an autopsy or working to reunite these or identify these folks and reunite these remains with their loved ones. So that is one of the number one reasons why we don't have a centralized, standardized effort to try to track these deaths along the border. So we're actually working through that. Those members of us that are members of the working group are working towards that end. So this, again, as I mentioned, this special issue includes 11 different articles, and each of these articles provide an overview of kind of what's going on the ground, as well as they offer policy recommendations to try to help reduce migrant deaths and suffering. So what I want to do today is I just want to highlight findings from, I would say maybe just 3 articles, and then I'll give you a sense of where you can go to get more information about what we do in this special issue, right? So the first actually comes from an article that I co-authored with my colleagues, Sam Chambers, Jeremy Slack, and Jeff Boyce. And here we're really interested in looking at what, if any, is the relationship between Title 42. So for those, most of you are probably familiar with, the COVID era Title 42 expulsions. Essentially, it was, in my opinion, one of several ways that the state has attempted to impede access to the U.S. asylum system. I think it's kind of very in line with what we saw under, for instance, metering or Remain in Mexico, the migrant protection protocols. You can make the argument that Title 42 or even the executive order that we saw the Biden administration pass this summer, those are all different ways that the state has tried to impede people's access to the asylum system. Okay, so what we ended up doing here is we're really interested in, again, drawing on data from the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner. That's what you have here. These are known migrant deaths in Southern Arizona from 1990 all the way up to fiscal year 2023. You can see the notable increase starting in the late 1990s, 2000s. That was, the direct result of the prevention through deterrence strategy that was launched border-wide in fiscal year 1994 here in Southern Arizona. Operation Safeguard, which was part of the prevention through deterrence strategy, launched in 95. Resources expanded in 97, but we actually didn't see resources materialize on the ground until 1999, and it was the next year that we saw that notable increase in deaths in Southern Arizona. So that's essentially what we call the funnel effect, and that's what we highlighted in that 2006 report by the Binational Migration Institute. But what I want to do right now briefly is just fast forward to these two eras, comparing deaths that occurred from 2014 all the way up until Title 42 was announced. So that would have been 2014 through roughly March of 2020, compared to when Title 42 was operational in Southern Arizona. And here you can actually see that the mean number of deaths in Southern Arizona during Title 42 increased from roughly 133 deaths per fiscal year to roughly 198, right? So clearly, under Title 42, people were dying, at higher numbers. Well, you might think, well, maybe more people were dying because there are more people crossing. Sure, that is a possibility. Although I would argue that people who are being processed under Title 42, and especially right now in this new era of migration along the border, I think things have changed drastically over the last decade or so. We're seeing an increase in asylum seekers arriving from all parts of the world. Not just young men coming to work in the United States to remit money to work seasonally and come back to Mexico, for instance. The era of that era of Mexican dominated migration has come and gone, in my opinion, right? What we're seeing now is more and more people arriving to the border to seek asylum. So under Title 42, when you have folks who are maybe can't go back home, have a very strong need to be with loved ones in the United States, under Title 42, what ended up happening is people were just being caught. They weren't able to start the credible fear process to start the the asylum process. They were expelled back to Mexico to a close port of entry, and they just kept trying to cross the border, right? And so we actually see this, this is backed up empirically, that during Title 42, especially among people who were processed through Title 42, the recidivism rate, the 1-year recidivism rate, meaning the proportion of folks who are apprehended by Border Patrol within a year prior to the most recent crossing, it increased substantially. It was like 60%, right, compared to less than 30% among people who weren't processed through Title 42. So there is something to this logic of people who have a desperate need to be in the United States, and when they're just returned and they're not able to access the asylum system, that they'll just keep trying to come back, right? And so actually what we wanted to do is compare these eras, 2014 to 2019 roughly, and then 2020 to 2023. We wanted to actually look to see whether or not the geography of migrant death changed, across during these two eras. And this is essentially what you see in this slide. These are 90, 95, and 99% confidence interval clusters of recovered remains. So prior to Title 42, you can see in the blue clusters, we saw the 90, 95, 99%. Essentially, these are hot spots, if you will, of where remains were being recovered. Really, we're talking about far off in the West Desert in Southern Arizona, near Ajo, by Organ Pipe National Monument. During Title 42, we started to see a notable shift in the geography of where people were being, where people's remains were being recovered from the West Desert, closer down to Nogales and closer to the border. Again, I think this supports our assertion that people during the Title 42 era, people were engaging in multiple crossing attempts out of this need to be in the United States and not being able to return back home, that we started to see more and more remains being recovered from just the outskirts of Nogales, closer to the port of entry, right? So I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Title 42 and how it relates to migrant deaths in Southern Arizona, please check out this article that I co-authored with Sam Chambers, Jeff Boyce, and Jeremy Slack. Another article I want to feature is an article by my colleagues Jasmine Hernandez and Heather Edgar of the Office of Medical Investigator in New Mexico. This is, to the best of my understanding, this is the first academic piece on migrant deaths in the state of New Mexico. Why? Because in the past, people really didn't cross through southern New Mexico, right? However, and you can actually see that these are based on their data. You can see that, in terms of migrant deaths in southern New Mexico, we were talking about less than 10 in a given fiscal year, right? However, right after 2020, right after COVID, we started to see the number of deaths increase in southern New Mexico quite a bit. And my understanding is, so last fiscal year, they hit, or 2 fiscal years ago in 2023, they hit 120. In 2024, they hit actually, if I'm not mistaken, over that. I think they're about 20 over that, about 140. Another interesting thing about New Mexico is we see a higher proportion of women among the deceased. So, for instance, in southern Arizona, it's roughly 15%. In Southern California, it's a little bit higher than that. I think it's like 20%. But in southern New Mexico, it's about 50-50. And in fact, I think last fiscal year, about 60% of the remains recovered were of women. So that's something that we're actually baffled. We're not really sure what's going on here. We know that among encounters, among apprehensions, it's not 50-50 male female. It tends to lean more male, but there's something going on in southern New Mexico. It might be related to the routes that women are taking. It might be related to the human smuggling operations. We're not sure. I think more data is needed, but I wanted to feature this, or I wanted to call your attention to this article because, again, it's one of the first empirical pieces, academic pieces on migrant deaths in southern Arizona. And then finally, I want to spend just a minute or two talking about an article that just came out. It wasn't part of the special issue, but Marnie and colleagues are part of the migrant the working group, if you will. And so this article just came out. It didn't quite make the special issue, but it was released last week. And this is on migrant deaths in Southern California. So unlike New Mexico, there has been a lot written on migrant deaths in Southern California, although nothing quite that recently. Okay, so what I want to do here is I just want to show you, okay, these again are data. The dark gray this is San Diego County Medical Examiner. That's data from them. The lighter gray is data from the coroner's office. And here we're a little bit more limited. We only have data going back to 2018 in this case. But I want to share with you just one important insight in terms of this notable jump from 2020 to 2021 and 2022. So a lot of this was being driven by deaths due to, how do people typically die in Southern California? They die due to exposure to the elements, drowning in the All-American Canal. But just recently, we've seen a new cause of death really become much more prevalent that we hadn't seen before. And these are deaths due to blunt force trauma, essentially falls from the border wall, right? So in the 2018, 19, 2020 period, only about 3% of those deaths were deaths due to falling from the wall. Fast forward in 2021, 2022, 2023, here we're talking about roughly 20% of deaths were due to falls from the wall. So again, if you're interested in learning more, I understand that you probably wouldn't be interested in reading all 11 articles, but what we did do as part of this initiative was we came up with these, what we call one-pagers or fact sheets. So if you go to the Binational Migration Institute website and you click under research, it'll take you to this drop-down menu where you see policy and briefs. And under each one of these tabs, we have these one-pagers, right? And so here, for instance, if you click on AZ findings and recommendations, it'll take you to this one-pager where it actually has an overview of what we found in the empirical pieces on Southern Arizona, an overview of what we found, the key findings and policy recommendations. So we have 5 of these fact sheets, or 5 of these one-pagers, one for the entire special issue, kind of border-wide, and then one for each of the 5 border states. So with that, I'm sure I'm well over my time. I did want to once again, thank you all and thank the Center for Migration Studies in New York. We wouldn't be able to have done this work without you all, and thank you for helping to get the word out about what I argue is this ongoing humanitarian crisis that doesn't seem to be letting up. And in fact, I'm not particularly optimistic that it will let up given what we're facing in the coming years. Thank you.
We may have time for 1 or 2 questions. The name of the volume, I didn't say it up front because it was quite a long title, but for those of you taking notes, Forced Migration, deterrence, and solutions to the non-natural disaster of migrant deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border and beyond, all in one. But it's a great
Quite the mouthful, yes.
it's a great volume, and it's on our website, cmsny.org, and it's on the SAGE website as well, right? Great. Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Oh, I'm sorry. One quick question.
Thank you, Professor Martinez. That was so interesting. I wonder if you could speak to, and I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but you're going to correct me. During the last Trump administration, there were some efforts by federal prosecutors to prosecute people who were doing humanitarian work, leaving out water, other efforts to lower or prevent migrant deaths. Can you speak to that work? Has any scholarly work been done on the effect of those efforts, and what do you think the people who run those efforts will face in the next 4 years?
That's a great question. So, obviously, this has been something that has been going on. Not, it even actually predates the Trump administration. I remember back when I was a graduate student, there were two college-age humanitarian workers. I think they're part of No More Deaths, if I'm not mistaken. Daniel and Shanti. They came across somebody who was really struggling, needed to be transported to a hospital immediately. This person would have died if it not had been for these two individuals putting them in the car and trying to take them to the hospital. They got pulled over by Border Patrol, and they end up getting accused of transport, I think, and harboring. I think essentially they tried to charge them with immigration crimes of smuggling and harboring. Another well-known case was that of Scott Warren, also a member of an NGO, adjunct lecturer at Arizona State. He was facing 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, for harboring, for smuggling, right? Oftentimes, in my experience, these tend to be relatively, they tend to be more symbolic. They tend to be more isolated. I mean, that obviously that's not to say that this didn't profoundly affect Scott's life or Daniel and Shanti's lives. I mean, they really were grappling with the idea of doing long-term time. But it is something that we see oftentimes, right? Between this kind of between Border Patrol authorities, non-state actors, vigilante groups, and then as well as these humanitarian aid groups and NGOs here in Southern Arizona. This essentially trying to use threats, or especially U.S. officials threatening folks for leaving, to try to render aid. So I mean, what we see right now is I think a lot of NGOs or members of NGOs have been pretty well educated in terms of what they can and cannot do in terms of the parameters of the law. We do know that there are several organizations that leave water out in the desert, leave food out in the desert. There are others that render immediate aid to individuals. And I wish I could tell you whether or not I anticipate we're going to see an increase in prosecutions trying to deter people from doing that. But the reality is, so as a side note, the discourse goes something like this. Well, these efforts encourage people to cross a border, right? And I can tell you that, having done in-depth interviews and surveys with border crossers, people who try to cross a border, get apprehended by U.S. authorities, and return back to Mexico, we actually tried to set up a survey module to get at the extent to which these folks are actually encountering this type of aid in the desert. And we asked them questions about whether or not they'd ever seen any of these individuals. Overwhelming majority have never seen them. Overwhelming majority of folks said that they would not, they would be maybe a little bit tentative to approach them because they wouldn't know if they worked for Border Patrol or who they were. So when we got to a point where really there isn't enough variation in these survey responses, right? When I asked them, would the possibility of encountering aid be a reason that you'd cross the border again? They just about, they thought it was preposterous. They thought it was actually quite funny. He said, we don't leave our homes because we think there might be a chance of us getting aid in the desert, right? This would be like if I am dying and they maybe would save my life, but to think that this is a motivating factor for me to try to cross the border is preposterous, right? So anyways, I know that wasn't necessarily a direct response to your answer. I wish I knew. I hope, I hope that that's not the case. But I guess I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an effort to try to, once again, criminally prosecute folks who are rendering aid. My sincere apologies. I have
Thank
to,
you.
I have to jump out. I hear the bells ringing. I have a faculty meeting right next door here. But I thank you all so much.
important.
Please, if you would like to, reach out to me, I'd be happy to share the one pagers with you all. I can share links to the articles. You can find my work on Google Scholar or academia.edu, ResearchGate. But once again, thank you all. Thank you all for all the work you all do. And thank you for helping us, give this issue the visibility it deserves.
Thank you, Doctor.